Frank Donahue awoke at 6 a.m. sharp, as he had done every weekday for the past 30 years. Without opening his eyes, he reached to his right, but the bed beside him was empty. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and the faint scent of perfume suggested that Elizabeth was already up. Frank smiled. In all their years together, his wife had never once let him leave for work without breakfast. He walked down the wooden stairs of their two-story Victorian house, the prettiest in Oak Ridge. The town was small, only 3,800 residents, but Frank and Elizabeth Donahue were considered the local elite. He, the sheriff of the county; she, the owner of the best house in town and organizer of charity events. "Good morning, dear." Elizabeth stood at the stove, elegant even in her silk robe. At 57, she looked 10 years younger, slim figure, well-groomed blonde hair in a casual bun, perfect posture. "Good morning, sweetheart." Frank came over and kissed her cheek. "Up at the crack of dawn again?" "I thought I'd finish my composition for the evening event at the library. You remember, don't you? It's a charity event tonight." Frank nodded, though he almost certainly would have forgotten if she hadn't reminded him. Unlike the ever-collective Elizabeth, he'd gotten a little absent-minded over the years. That didn't keep him from being the best sheriff Oak Ridge had ever seen, though. Breakfast was perfect, as was everything Elizabeth made. Scrambled eggs with herbs, toast, coffee, just the strength Frank liked. They had breakfast on the veranda overlooking the garden, another testament to the homeowner's impeccable taste. Every flower bed, every shrub was thoughtfully tended. "Dave's been poking around again, asking about your beauty secret." Frank grinned, remembering his conversation with the deputy yesterday. "He said that his Martha had tried everything, and that you were as far away from her as the moon." Elizabeth smiled, but tensely. "Tell him the secret is a happy marriage. When you wake up 30 years later with a man who looks at you like you're the eighth wonder of the world, you don't need any beauticians." They met in Denver 32 years ago. Frank, then a young police officer, noticed Elizabeth at a charity ball. She stood out among the other girls, not flashy beauty, but a special grace and confidence. He took 2 months of courtship to achieve a first date, and another 6 months to propose. Elizabeth told a little about her past. She grew up in an orphanage, never knowing her parents. Her only relative was her brother Robert, with whom she had long since lost touch. Frank never insisted on details. Everyone has a right to their secrets, especially if they hurt. A year after their marriage, they moved to Oak Ridge, where Frank was offered a position as a deputy sheriff. Elizabeth supported him, even though it meant leaving a prestigious job at a design firm. She quickly found herself in a small town, turning their home into a cultural center. "Are you going to be late tonight?" Elizabeth asked, picking up the dishes. "I'll try to be back by 6 so I can make it to your event," Frank answered, putting on his uniform hat. "Unless something happens." In Oak Ridge, there was rarely anything more serious than petty hooliganism or family quarrels. The last murder had been 5 years ago, when Farmer Johnson had shot his neighbor over a boundary dispute. Frank kissed his wife and headed for the service pickup. As he drove down Main Street, he waved to people he knew as usual. Everyone knew each other here, and the Donahues were universally respected. Dave Miller, his deputy and friend of 25 years, was already at the station. "Coffee?" Dave asked in lieu of a greeting. "No, thanks, just had breakfast." Frank hung up his hat and sat at his desk, reviewing the night's reports. "Anything interesting?" "It's all quiet. Only Mrs. Parker was complaining about the teenagers at the supermarket again." Typical Oak Ridge day. Frank checked the patrol cars, had a brief meeting with his subordinates, went to the school for a preventative talk. After lunch, he stopped by City Hall to discuss the budget for the next quarter. He got home earlier than usual, around 5. He wanted to surprise Elizabeth, but it seemed he'd surprised himself. Her car wasn't in the driveway. Strange. Usually, before events, she spent the whole day at home getting ready. Frank opened the door with his key and walked into the hallway. "Elizabeth?" he called out, but the house was empty. There was a note on the kitchen table. "Had to make an emergency trip to Denver to get materials for the compositions. Be back by 6. Dinner's in the oven. Kisses, A." Denver was an hour away. Strange she hadn't called. Frank pulled out his phone and dialed his wife's number, but the call went to voicemail. He shrugged and went upstairs to change. That evening in the library, Elizabeth shone as usual. No one would have suspected that even during the day she had been agitated and distracted. For the past 2 weeks, Frank had noticed the change. The nervous movements, the lost look, the whispering on the phone late at night. At first he wrote it off as a normal malaise or fatigue, but today's sudden trip alerted him. "Frank! Buddy!" Jack Morrison, a neighbor and longtime friend, clapped him on the shoulder. "Your Elizabeth has outdone herself again. Look how beautiful it is." The centerpiece of the table was an arrangement of fresh flowers and dried herbs so artfully arranged that they seemed to dance in the air. "I can't take my eyes off it," said Susan, Jack's wife. "How does she do it?" "Talent," Frank replied simply, proudly watching his wife interact with the guests. Bill Carpenter, the owner of a local restaurant, approached him. "Your wife is a real treasure, Sheriff. I swear she's only gotten more beautiful in 30 years. Frank nodded. It was true. Elizabeth kept herself in great shape. Regular exercise, proper nutrition, expensive cosmetic procedures. They could afford it. The sheriff's salary wasn't bad, and Elizabeth worked part-time as an interior designer. The evening was a success. Elizabeth raised a record $18,000 for the children's ward of the hospital. When they returned home, Frank felt proud of his wife, but could not get rid of a vague anxiety. "How was the trip to Denver?" he asked, as if by the way as they were getting ready for bed. Elizabeth froze for a moment. "It was fine. The flower store almost let me down, but I managed to get everything." "You could have called. I would have gone." It was too spontaneous. She quickly changed into her nightgown and slid under the covers. "I'm tired. Let's go to sleep?" Frank wanted to ask something else, but decided not to insist. Elizabeth turned off the light and turned her back to the wall. Unusual behavior for a woman who had spent 30 years falling asleep in his arms. For the next few days, Frank watched his wife carefully. She tried to behave as usual, but he knew her too well. Something was definitely wrong. Twice he noticed her whispering on the phone, and when she saw him, she quickly dropped the call. On Friday, when Frank got home early, the phone rang while Elizabeth was in the shower. He picked up the handset machine-atically. "Hello, Donahue residence." On the other end of the line, a male voice asked, "Elizabeth? It's me. I have the results. We need to talk." "I'm sorry, this is her husband. Elizabeth can't come over right now." "Who is it?" Pause. I'm sorry. I got the wrong number." The call was cut off. When Elizabeth came downstairs, Frank told her about the strange call. Some man had called, talking about some results. Elizabeth turned pale, but quickly pulled herself together. "The debt collectors must have gotten the wrong number again. That's the 3rd time this month. But he asked for you by name. Maybe it's about the last order." She shrugged and changed the subject. "What are we doing this weekend? Jack invited us over for a barbecue." Frank nodded, deciding to hold off on asking for now. Perhaps all these little things were forming a far-fetched picture in his head, but his intuition, which had rarely failed him in his 25 years on the force, said otherwise. They did go to the Morrisons' house for a barbecue on Saturday. Jack, a former military doctor and now a consultant at a local clinic, grilled steaks and told tales from his practice. Susan and Elizabeth discussed the new school program. Susan worked as a teacher. The evening was warm and pleasant, but Frank couldn't quite relax. He noticed Elizabeth flinch when her phone vibrated. She apologized and stepped back into the garden to answer it. When she returned 5 minutes later, she looked pale. "Is everything all right?" Frank asked. "Yeah, just a client about a design project. We'll have to go to Denver next week." Frank nodded, but noticed Jack cast Elizabeth an odd look. A doctor's habit of picking up on symptoms? They got home late. Elizabeth went straight upstairs, citing a headache. Frank stayed in the living room, pondering whether to confront her. Something was clearly going on, and it was something Elizabeth was keeping from him. He went upstairs half an hour later. His wife was already asleep or pretending to be asleep. There was a telephone on her bedside table. Frank knew he shouldn't do this, but the anxiety overpowered. He gingerly picked up the phone. The screen was locked, but the notification of a new message was still hanging. "Robert, results confirmed. Time is short. We need to..." The text cut off. Robert? The brother she supposedly hadn't spoken to in years? Frank put the phone down and lay down next to his wife. Elizabeth didn't move, but he sensed she was awake. He decided he would be sure to talk to her tomorrow. Whatever problems arose, they would deal with them together as they had always done. But in the morning, Elizabeth got up before he did and left, leaving a note. Urgently called to Denver. I'll be back tonight. Don't worry. Love. The flawless life they'd been building for 30 years was suddenly covered in cracks, and Frank had no idea what was going on. You're right about the physiological inconsistency. That was a serious narrative error. Thanks for pointing that out. Indeed, the conversation with Jack should be in Chapter 3 according to the plan. I will rewrite Chapter 2, correcting these errors. Frank really shouldn't suspect anything strange when talking about identical twins, since he is far from medical intricacies. Elizabeth returned late in the afternoon. Frank was sitting in the living room pretending to watch a baseball game, although he couldn't really concentrate on the game. When he heard the sound of the door opening, he was relieved. Hi, Elizabeth said as she entered the room. She looked exhausted but tried to smile. Sorry for the sudden departure. Is everything okay? Frank asked, turning off the TV. You look a little pale. Elizabeth sat down on the couch next to him and took a deep breath. We need to talk, she said in a tone that made Frank's insides tighten. He nodded, preparing for the worst. They'd been through a lot in their 30 years of marriage financial difficulties early in life, the death of his parents, difficult moves, but they'd always supported each other. No matter what happened now, they would get through it, Frank convinced himself. I have to go to the hospital, Elizabeth said, looking at her hands. In Denver. What? Frank's heart skipped a beat. What's wrong? Kidney problems. She looked up. Nothing fatal, don't worry, just need some procedures. What kind of procedures? Why didn't you say anything? When did it start? Elizabeth smiled weakly. I didn't want to worry you prematurely. I had the checkup 2 weeks ago when I went to get materials for the fundraiser. I was told the results today. Frank took her hands in his. We'll go together. I'll take a vacation. Dave can manage a few days without me. No, Elizabeth answered too quickly. That won't be necessary. The procedure is simple. It will only take a few days. Besides, you have an important meeting with the district attorney on Wednesday. To hell with the meeting, Frank exclaimed. This is about your health. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. Please, Frank. I'll feel better if you stay here and mind your own business. I'll be in touch. They argued for another half hour, but Elizabeth was adamant. Eventually, Frank gave in, though something about the situation seemed wrong to him. Why was she so insistent on refusing his support? This wasn't like Elizabeth at all. When do you have to go? He asked at last. Wednesday. I've already made arrangements with Dr. Fisher. He's an old friend of my doctor in Denver. Frank noticed the hesitation, but didn't pay much attention to it. Elizabeth looked really tired, and he decided not to push any further. They went upstairs, and for the first time in days, his wife fell asleep in his arms. Tuesday night. Frank came home early and caught Elizabeth talking on the phone in the backyard. He didn't want to eavesdrop, but as he approached the porch door, he involuntarily heard a scrap of conversation. All set. Dr. Fisher says the odds are good. Yes, I know the risks, but there's no other way. Of course, Robert, I love you too. She turned off the phone and stood motionless for a while, staring into space. Frank quietly backed away and walked into the house through the front door, slamming it loudly to warn of his arrival. I'm home, he shouted. In the kitchen, Elizabeth called back. When he entered, she was already standing at the stove, pretending to have been cooking dinner all along. Her cheeks were slightly flushed, but otherwise she seemed calm. How was your day? She asked. The usual, Frank replied, watching her. And you? I packed for the hospital and arranged for Susan to take care of the flowers. Dinner passed in relative silence. Afterward, they sat on the veranda, drinking tea and looking at the stars, a long tradition they'd maintained throughout their years of marriage. Do you remember our first night in this house? Elizabeth asked. We sat here until dawn and dreamed of the future. Frank nodded. You said you wanted to grow old on this veranda, holding my hands. And I haven't changed my mind. She squeezed his palm. Whatever happens, Frank, know that you are the best thing that ever happened to me. There was a strange note of farewell in her voice that kept Frank awake all night. In the morning, he walked Elizabeth to her car. She had brought a small suitcase with her, the bare minimum of necessities. I'll call you when I get there, she promised, kissing him. "Don't worry about me. Call me directly from the hospital," he asked, "and tell me the name of the clinic and the room number, just in case." Elizabeth reluctantly agreed. As soon as her car was around the corner, Frank went back inside. He couldn't shake the feeling that his wife was hiding something. Why was she so insistent on driving alone? What was the kidney procedure? And what role was her brother, with whom she supposedly hadn't spoken in years, playing in all this? Frank went into his office and turned on his computer. He opened his browser history. Elizabeth rarely cleared it, believing they had nothing to hide from each other. In his recent queries, he saw kidney transplant, close relative compatibility, risks of kidney donation. Donation? Elizabeth was planning to be a donor? But for whom? An overheard conversation popped into my head. Robert, her brother. Frank leaned back in his chair, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. It sounded like Elizabeth was going to give the kidney to her brother, but for some reason, she was keeping it from him. The phone rang, snapping him out of his musings. "I made it." Elizabeth's voice sounded a little strained. "Already at the hospital. I'm checking in now." "What's the name of the clinic?" Frank asked. Pause. "Denver Memorial Medical Center, Nephrology Department." "Room number?" "I don't know yet. They'll tell me after I check in." "Call me as soon as you know," Frank insisted. "Okay," she sighed. "Frank, I love you. Please don't worry. Everything is going to be okay." The call ended and Frank continued to sit with the phone in his hand. Something was definitely wrong. He could feel it with every cell in his body. Back at the station, Dave noticed his concern. "Was something wrong?" he asked when Frank checked the phone for the third time in 5 minutes. "Elizabeth's in the hospital," Frank answered. "In Denver. Something with her kidneys." "Shit, I'm sorry, but she's in good hands. Medicine's doing wonders these days." Frank nodded without going into details. The meeting with the district attorney took all morning, but the sheriff's thoughts were far from the security issues at hand. The promised call from Elizabeth never came. By lunchtime, Frank couldn't stand it any longer and dialed her number himself, but the phone was off. This finally convinced him that something serious was going on. "Dave, I have to leave," he said as he walked into the deputy's office. "Can you take over until tomorrow?" "Sure." Dave looked at him understandingly. "Go to Elizabeth's. Nothing will happen to the city." Frank quickly returned home, changed into civilian clothes, and got into his personal car, a black Ford they had bought 3 years ago. It was a little over an hour's drive to Denver. Memorial Medical Center was a complex of modern buildings in the center of town. Frank parked and headed toward the main entrance. There was a young woman on duty at the information desk. "Hello," Frank addressed her. "I need to find a patient, Elizabeth Donahue. She was supposed to be admitted to the nephrology department today." The woman checked the computer. "I'm sorry, but we don't have a patient by that name." "Check again, please," Frank insisted. "She should definitely be here. Maybe it hasn't been entered into the system yet." The girl shook her head. There were only 3 patients admitted to the nephrology department today, and Elizabeth Donahue wasn't one of them. Could it be another clinic? He thanked her and stepped aside, pulling out his cell phone. He dialed Elizabeth's number, still off. Then he called 3 other major Denver hospitals, but got the same answer: no patient by that name. What if she used a different name? But why? The hunch came suddenly. He went back to the counter. "Excuse me again. Could you please check to see if a patient named Robert Clark was admitted today?" The girl went back to the computer. "Yes, Robert Clark was admitted this morning. Transplant unit, 5th floor, room 512. Transplantology." So he was right. Elizabeth was going to give the kidney to her brother. But why had she lied about being treated herself? Frank went up to the 5th floor. The hallway was quiet, with only the nurses busily moving between rooms. He found room 512 and knocked. "Come in," came a man's voice. Frank opened the door and saw a thin man about Elizabeth's age lying in a hospital bed. Outwardly, he looked subtly like his wife. Same blonde hair, different facial features, but the general texture was unmistakable. "Robert Clark?" Frank asked. The man looked surprised. "Yes, and you are?" "Frank Donahue, Elizabeth's husband." Robert turned pale. "Oh, I didn't know you were coming." Elizabeth didn't tell me she was going to visit you, Frank replied, entering the room and closing the door behind him. In fact, she claimed she was going to the hospital herself with kidney problems. Robert looked embarrassed. It's hard to explain. Try. Frank sat down on the chair next to the bed. I understand correctly that Elizabeth is going to be your kidney donor? Robert nodded. Yes, I have kidney failure. Dialysis is no longer doing the job. Without a transplant, I wouldn't have more than a year to live. And you found Elizabeth after all these years? Actually, Robert faltered, we never lost touch. We didn't see each other much. This was news. Elizabeth had always said she didn't talk to her brother. Why hide such a small thing? Where is she now? Frank asked. Pre-op prep. The surgery's tomorrow. Why didn't she tell me the truth? Robert sighed. She knew you'd be against it. Donation is a serious risk, especially at our age. I would never have stopped her from saving her brother, Frank countered. But I have a right to know what's going on with my wife. Robert was silent for a long moment, staring out the window. Then he said, Of course you're right. It's just that Elizabeth, she's always been very independent. And she loves you very much. She didn't want to bother you. Frank studied the face of his interlocutor. Something about the man seemed vaguely familiar, though he was sure he had never met Elizabeth's brother before. How long have you known about your illness? He asked. I was diagnosed 3 years ago. It wasn't so bad at first, but in the last few months it has worsened dramatically. And Elizabeth knew all this time? No, I only told her 2 weeks ago when it became clear that the transplant was necessary. Why her? Aren't there other donors? Robert looked at him with slight surprise. There are 2 other options, but her kidney is a perfect match because we're identical twins. Frank frowned. Identical? I never would have guessed that. You 2 don't look alike at all. It happens, Robert shrugged. Genes are a strange thing. Mr. Donahue? There was a nurse standing in the doorway. Are you related to the patient? I'm his brother-in-law, Frank answered. The sister's husband. Mr. Clark needs to rest before his surgery tomorrow. You can come back tomorrow. Sure, Frank stood up. Can you tell me where my wife is right now? Elizabeth Donahue. She's a donor for Mr. Clark. The donors are in the other wing, the nurse replied. I'm afraid it's off limits right now because of the risk of infection. You'll be able to see her tomorrow after the operation. Frank nodded, realizing it was useless to argue. Tell her I'm here, okay? And that I love her. I will, the nurse smiled. Frank looked at Robert again. Get well, we'll talk again. When he left the hospital, Frank got into his car. He was overcome with strange thoughts. Why had Elizabeth lied about her brother all these years? Why hide the fact that she was going to be a donor? And that statement about identical twins? But deep down, he was glad that everything had been explained. His wife just wanted to save her brother without dragging him into the story. Frank decided to stay in Denver for the night, checked into a small hotel near the hospital and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. There were too many questions swirling around in his head, but one thing he knew for sure. Tomorrow he would see Elizabeth and talk to her. Whatever secrets she was keeping, they would find a way out together. The next morning, Frank was at the hospital by 8 o'clock. The surgery was scheduled to begin at 9. He had hoped to see Elizabeth before she was wheeled into the operating room, but he was again turned away, citing rules. I just want to support my wife before the surgery, he insisted. Mr. Donahue, I understand your concern, the charge nurse said, but the pre-operative preparations have already begun. You will be able to see your wife after the operation, in the recovery room. Frank gave up and settled into the waiting area. Time dragged agonizingly slow. He flipped through old magazines, occasionally went to the window, but his thoughts kept returning to Elizabeth and her mysteries. Around noon, the same nurse approached him. Mr. Donahue, the operation was a success. Your wife is now in the recovery room. She's not quite out of anesthesia yet, but you're welcome to visit her. Frank followed the nurse down a long corridor to another wing of the building. They stopped at the door of the ward. Just don't tire her out, the nurse warned. 15 minutes, no more. Frank nodded and went in. Elizabeth was lying on the bed, pale and tired, but to his relief, alive and seemingly fine. She slowly turned her head and smiled when she saw him. "Hello," she whispered. "You made it after all." "Of course I did." Frank walked over and took her hand. "How could I not have come? I didn't want you to worry." Her voice was weak. "I met with Robert," Frank said. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Elizabeth closed his eyes. "It's hard to explain. We'll have time." He stroked her cheek. "You rest now. I'm not going anywhere." A week had passed since the surgery. Elizabeth was recovering faster than the doctors had expected. Robert's condition was also improving. His body had accepted the new kidney well. Frank had taken a 2-week vacation to care for his wife, and now they were home again in Oak Ridge. The evening air was filled with the fragrance of blossoming apple trees. Frank sat on the veranda, watching the last rays of the sun color the horizon with golden hues. Elizabeth was resting upstairs, having taken a painkiller. She had been quiet and brooding the last few days, and though she attributed it to fatigue after the surgery, Frank sensed it was something else. The sound of a car pulling up made him turn his head. Jack Morrison, waving a 6-pack of beer, was heading toward the veranda. "Thought I'd check on the heroine of the day." He smiled. "How is she?" "Sleeping," Frank answered. "The doctors say she's recovering well, but she needs rest. Then we'll keep it quiet." Jack sat down in a nearby chair and handed Frank a can of beer. "To your wife's health." They clinked their cans together. Frank took a sip and leaned back, feeling the tension of the last few days begin to let go. "You know, it never ceases to amaze me," he said. All these years, Elizabeth had claimed to have had little contact with her brother, and it turns out they kept in touch. People hide strange things sometimes." Jack shrugged. Maybe there were some differences between them that she didn't want to talk about. "Maybe," Frank nodded. "Robert seems like a nice guy. It's just odd that they don't look alike at all, even though he claims they're identical twins." Jack, who was just taking a sip, choked. "I'm sorry, what?" He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Identical twins? Brother and sister?" "Yeah." Frank looked at his friend with a puzzled expression. "What's the big deal?" Jack put the jar on the table, his face taking on a serious expression. "Frank, that's impossible. Identical twins are always the same sex, always. It's when one fertilized egg splits into 2. Genetically, they're identical, and a brother and sister can only be identical." Frank frowned. "Are you sure?" "Positive. It's basic medicine. Ask any first-year medical student." Frank felt something chill inside. Why would Robert lie? Or was he really that ignorant about medical matters? "Maybe he just got the terms mixed up," Frank suggested, not wanting to think of other possibilities. "Not everyone knows the terminology." "Maybe," Jack agreed, but there was doubt in his eyes. "It's strange to hear that from someone who's getting an organ transplant, though. Usually they're explained to them in great detail." They turned the conversation to other topics: work, baseball, the latest city news, but Jack's phrase stuck in Frank's mind like a splinter. By the time Jack left, it was quite dark. Frank went upstairs to check on Elizabeth. She was still asleep, and in the faint nightlight her face seemed peaceful, almost youthful. 30 years around this man. Could she be hiding something so important? Frank went down to his office and turned on his computer. He typed "identical twins" into the search engine and started reading. Jack was right. Identical twins are always the same sex. It's a scientific fact that allows for no exceptions. Then, why did Robert say they were identical? A mistake, a lie, and if a lie, why? Frank leaned back in his chair, trying to put together the disparate pieces of the puzzle. Something was eluding his grasp, something important. He remembered the oddities in Elizabeth's behavior in recent years. She never spoke of her childhood, always avoided talking about the period before they met. He put it down to painful memories of life in the orphanage. But what if the reason was something else? Frank spent the night without sleep, tossing and turning on the living room couch so as not to wake Elizabeth. Thoughts swirled in his head like vultures over prey. In the morning, as the first rays of sunlight touched the windows, he made a decision. He needed to talk to Robert again, face to face, without Elizabeth. "I'll go grocery shopping," he told his wife over breakfast. "Do you need anything?" "No, thanks." Elizabeth looked better than yesterday, but she was still pale. Just don't stay too long. I don't like being alone." It was a lie. In 30 years of marriage, Elizabeth had never complained about being alone. On the contrary, she treasured the hours when she could be alone. Another oddity to add to her suspicions. Frank kissed her on the forehead and left the house. He got in his car and headed not for the supermarket, but for the highway to Denver. He had a holster on his belt with his service weapon. As sheriff, he was authorized to carry it even off-duty. Usually he left the gun at home, but today something made him take the weapon with him. The drive to Denver flew by. Thoughts of the upcoming conversation with Robert drowned out everything else. What would he say? How would he react to a direct question? And what if his suspicions were confirmed? Frank parked outside the hospital and headed toward the main entrance with a determined stride. He knew where to find Robert. In the same room, 512. The door was ajar. Robert was sitting on the bed looking through some papers. He looked much better than he had the week before. "Mr. Donahue!" He looked genuinely surprised. "I didn't expect to see you. We need to talk." Frank closed the door behind him and sat down in a chair. "About you and Elizabeth." Robert tensed, but tried to keep a nonchalant expression on his face. "Of course. How is she, by the way? The doctors said it went well." "She's recovering," Frank answered briefly. "I want you to explain something to me. Last time you said that you and Elizabeth are identical twins. Is that true?" Robert turned visibly pale. Yes, of course. We were born on the same day, the same womb." "That's not what I meant," Frank interrupted him. "Identical twins are always the same sex. Always. It's a scientific fact. So how can you and Elizabeth be identical twins?" There was a heavy pause. Robert stared at his hands, clenching and unclenching his fingers. "You're right," he said quietly at last. "We can't be identical twins of different sexes. Because we're not. Or rather, we weren't from the beginning." Frank felt the ground slipping from under his feet. "What do you mean?" Robert looked up, his eyes filled with the determination of a man who was finally letting go of a heavy weight. "We were born boys, identical male twins, Edward and Robert Clark. Edward later became Elizabeth." Frank was petrified. Robert's words came from far away as if through a thick, absorbent cotton. "You're lying," he whispered. "No." Robert shook his head. "I would never have told you this secret if you hadn't guessed it yourself. Elizabeth, she's come a long way. Hormone therapy, surgeries. That was before you even met her. She wanted to start a new life, be her real self. 30 years, Frank's voice shook. 30 years she lied to me." "She didn't lie," Robert said softly. "She just didn't talk about the past that hurt her. Elizabeth had always been a woman inside, just born in the wrong body." Frank stood up, unable to listen any longer. The room was spinning before his eyes. "Where is she now?" Robert asked anxiously. "You're not going to—" "None of your business." Frank cut him off and walked out, slamming the door. He leaned against the wall in the hallway, trying to control his emotions. 30 years of his life had been built on lies. The woman he had loved, the woman he had dedicated his life to, was a man? That can't be true. It's some kind of nightmare. But deep down, he knew Robert was telling the truth. There were too many things to explain. The lack of children, Elizabeth's reluctance to talk about the past, her insistence on controlling certain aspects of their intimate life. Frank walked out of the hospital and got into his car. His hands were shaking so badly that he was not immediately able to insert the key into the ignition. One thought pulsed in his head: to go home and demand an explanation. The drive back took less than an hour. All that time, Frank tried to calm down, to find a rational explanation, but the anger and sense of betrayal only grew. He parked in front of the house and sat motionless for a while, gathering his thoughts. Then he got out of the car and walked resolutely toward the front door. Elizabeth was sitting in the living room with a book. When she saw the look on his face, she turned pale and put the book aside. "What's wrong?" she asked, but it was obvious in her eyes that she already knew the answer. "I talked to Robert," Frank said, his voice sounding cold and detached. "He told me the truth, about you, about both of you." Elizabeth closed her eyes as if in physical pain. "Frank, Is it true?" he interrupted, taking a step forward. "Tell me right now, were you born a man?" She nodded slowly, not averting her gaze. Yes, but I've always been a woman inside, Frank. Always. He felt something shiver inside. So Robert hadn't lied. 30 years, he said in a choked voice. 30 years you've been deceiving me. I didn't lie. Elizabeth rose from the couch, her movements cautious because of the recent surgery. I just didn't tell you about a past that didn't matter anymore. Didn't matter? Fury rang in his voice. You think it doesn't matter to me that my wife... He couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. I am the same woman you fell in love with 32 years ago, Elizabeth said, trying to remain calm. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed! Frank shouted, his face contorted with anger. My whole life has been built on lies! He felt his hand reaching for his holster. His fingers clutched the grip of the gun, and he drew the weapon without fully realizing what he was doing. When Elizabeth saw the gun, she froze. Frank, she said quietly, put the gun down. Let's talk calmly. How can I talk calmly? His hand with the gun was trembling. Do you realize what you've done to me? My whole life? I realize you need time. Elizabeth's voice was strained but controlled. You're shocked. That's normal. But Frank, we can get through this together. Together? He laughed bitterly. Do you really think we can stay together after this? I don't know, she answered honestly. But I do know that the last 30 years have not been a lie. What we had between us was real. Frank shook his head, his mind refusing to accept her words. At this moment, not just the collapse of a marriage was happening before his eyes. His entire reality, everything he believed to be true, was crumbling. Why? He asked hoarsely. Why didn't you tell me from the beginning? I was afraid, Elizabeth answered simply. Afraid of losing you. And then it was too late. The gun in Frank's hand was heavy, but he couldn't put it down. It was the only thing keeping him from falling apart completely. Something tangible, real in a world that had suddenly lost all outline. You should have told me, he said. I had a right to know. Yes, she agreed. You're right, and I've wanted to many times, but each time I couldn't find the strength. Elizabeth took a slow step forward, holding out her hand. Frank, please put the gun down. Stay back, he warned, backing away. Yeah, I don't know what to do. There were tears in his eyes, not just from the pain of betrayal, but from the realization that he still loved this man. And that was the worst part. I know you feel cheated, Elizabeth continued, but think of everything we've been through together. Didn't it mean anything to you? Frank looked at the woman in front of him, at her face, which he had kissed 1,000 times, at the hands that held him in moments of despair, at the eyes in which he saw so much love. And gradually his anger began to give way to a deep, agonizing confusion. I don't know who you are, he said quietly. I don't know who I am. You're the same Frank, she said. And I'm the same Elizabeth. Nothing can change who we are now. The gun in his hand began to lower slowly. Perhaps they really could talk. Perhaps, in time. At that moment, there was a deafening explosion outside. Neighborhood kids had set off a firecracker right under the windows of their house. Frank, trained by years of police work, reacted instinctively to the sharp sound. His finger involuntarily pulled the trigger. The shot rang through the silence of the house like a thunderclap. Elizabeth staggered, a red stain spreading across her light-colored blouse. Her eyes filled with surprise mixed with pain. She fell to her knees, then collapsed onto her side. No, Frank whispered, unable to believe his eyes. No! He threw the gun away and rushed to her, falling to his knees beside her. Lifting her head, he pressed his palm against the wound, trying to stop the blood. Elizabeth, hold on. I didn't mean to... God, I didn't mean it. He pulled out his cell phone, dialed 911 with trembling fingers. I'm hurt. My wife. Please hurry. Elizabeth stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. She tried to say something, but only a faint moan escaped her mouth. Don't talk. Frank pulled her close, feeling the life drain from her body. Help is on the way. Just hang on. But he knew it was too late. The bullet had gone straight through the heart. Blood soaked everything around him, staining the light-colored carpet a dark red. Elizabeth squeezed his hand weakly. Her lips silently said something that could have been the words sorry or love. And then, the light in her eyes faded, and the hand Frank was holding went limp. "No," he whispered, pulling her against him. "No, no, no." He sat like that, holding his wife's lifeless body as the police and ambulance arrived. He didn't resist as they dragged him away, handcuffed him, read him his rights. He didn't feel anything anymore. At the station, Dave looked at him with disbelief and horror. "Frank, what happened?" he asked as he entered the interrogation room. "Elizabeth, she's dead." Frank's voice was lifeless. "I killed her, but I didn't mean to. It was an accident." "But why did you point a gun at her in the first place?" Dave sat across from him, unable to understand how his friend, a respected sheriff, could do such a thing. Frank raised empty eyes to him. "She was a man," he said. "All this time. 30 years I've been married to a man who was born a man." Dave shook his head incredulously. "And you? Because of that?" "I don't know what came over me." Frank dropped his head into his hands. "I just lost myself. And then that firecracker. I pulled the trigger involuntarily." "Oh God, Frank." "Accident or not," Frank said quietly, "she's dead, and I'm here, and I'll be here for the rest of my life." He was transferred to the county jail to await trial. The cell was small and gray, the perfect place for a man whose soul had died with Elizabeth. On the third day, Detective Lauren Sanford from Homicide came to see him. "Mr. Donahue," she sat down across from him, opening a file folder. "I'm investigating the murder of your wife, Elizabeth Donahue." Frank nodded silently. "Do you admit to shooting her?" "Yes. Can you explain how it happened?" Frank was silent for a long time, staring into space. Then he said, "I found out the truth about her past. I was shocked, angry. I drew my weapon. I don't know why. I wasn't going to shoot. But a firecracker went off outside and He couldn't finish. "Are you saying it was an accident?" "Yes," Frank nodded. "But that's no excuse. Nothing can justify what I did." The detective wrote something down in her notebook. "Your wife, did she threaten you? Assaulted you?" "No." Frank shook his head. "She was just trying to explain, and I couldn't handle the truth." The detective wrote something else down, then closed the notebook. "Mr. Donahue, you will be charged with murder. Given the circumstances and your testimony, the prosecutor may consider manslaughter, but I must warn you, even so, the punishment will be severe." "I deserve it," Frank said quietly. "Are you remorseful?" "Every second," Frank answered, tears in his eyes. "But that doesn't change anything. She's dead and I'm here, and that's the way it's going to be for the rest of my life." Detective Sanford stood up, gathering her papers. "One more question, Mr. Donahue. If you could go back, knowing what you know now, what would you do?" Frank was silent for a long time, staring at the wall. Then he said, "I would have listened to her. I'd give her a chance to explain, and I would never, ever have picked up a gun." The detective nodded and headed for the door. At the exit, she turned around. "You know, Mr. Donahue, sometimes the worst prisons are the ones we build ourselves, in our heads, in our hearts." She walked out, leaving Frank alone with his thoughts. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held Elizabeth for 30 years and then taken her life. Outside the prison walls, life went on. In Oak Ridge, people whispered, discussing the tragedy. Some condemned Elizabeth for her deception. Some condemned Frank for his cruelty. But most were simply grieving over 2 ruined lives. Robert Clark stood at his sister's grave, holding white roses, her favorite flowers. After the funeral, he left town, taking with him the last part of a story that began so long ago. The story of 2 brothers, one of whom always knew he was born in the wrong body. And in his cell at the county jail, Frank Donahue sat on the edge of his bunk, holding the only picture he was allowed to keep, their wedding photo. Elizabeth smiled in her white dress, happy and beautiful. Real, always real. Only now did he realize it.